Edinburgh has not learned to live with its ignominious title of AIDS capital of Europe. The widespread use of drugs in some areas of the city has led to an explosive spread of the infection. The sharing of needles to inject heroin and the consequent passing on of
infected blood
is the main way in which the virus can be.
Edinburgh has always been known for its rich culture and history, but beneath its charm lies a hidden world, a criminal underbelly that evolved dramatically over the decades. What began as a landscape dominated by notorious figures and organized crime rings took a drastic turn in the 1970s, changing the scene forever. The rules of the streets were rewritten, fueling violence, tragedy, and a wave of crime unlike anything the city had seen before. In this video, we'll explore the dark evolution of Edinburgh's crime scene, uncovering the events and key figures that deeply impacted the city's underworld and left scars still visible today. Edinburgh's streets in the 1960s were a dangerous battleground. Violence claimed lives, left many wounded, and forged a new kind of survivor, those who would rise to power and carve out their own kingdoms. In this gritty underworld, a few men held sway, with reputations so fierce that stepping out of line came at a high price. Unlike Glasgow's notorious Arthur Thompson, Edinburgh had no single godfather figure at the helm. Instead, each neighborhood had its own ruler, feared and respected on their turf. In Tollcross, it was Billy Lynch and his brothers who held the reins. In Pilton, it was Jimmy Fats Lovell, and in Granton, Bob Carse. Meanwhile, Broughton was home to two of the hardest men on the streets, Ronnie Turnbull and John Gray. Figures you wouldn't dare cross a second time. Back then, it was a different kind of underworld. Today, we see young men running around with zombie knives the size of their arms, turning postcodes into war zones over petty rivalries and racking up murder charges. But in those days, it was about toughness and earning respect on the streets. Many of these men established their reputations before stepping into organized crime. For them, profit took precedence over senseless violence. Their money came from robberies, protection rackets, and money laundering, crimes that some street players might even call respectable. But everything changed when heroin arrived. In the 1970s, Edinburgh's crime scene began to shift dramatically as the heroin market took root. New players recognized the immense profits, smuggling the drug in through the docks or from cities like Newcastle and London. Within a decade, as heroin began to take hold in Glasgow, Edinburgh's housing schemes were already ravaged by addiction. Junkies filled the streets, petty crime surged, and HIV spread rapidly, leaving a trail of devastation. The street players seemed to be the only ones reaping any reward. But for many of them, the 1980s marked the beginning of their downfall. Peter Williamson, Billy Boswell, and John Paddy Reilly, owner of the now demolished Americana Club, were influential figures in Edinburgh's criminal scene from the 1960s onward. Rumor had it that these men made their fortunes through armed raids on post offices, though nothing was ever proven, or maybe they were just that good that they never got caught. Like Reilly, Williamson and Boswell invested their earnings into pubs, clubs, and occasionally saunas. In Edinburgh, where authorities took a more lenient stance on the sex industry, saunas were seen as relatively safe and profitable ventures. Paddy Reilly adored his daughters, Pauline and Dawn, and took pride in seeing them work at his club, which had since been renamed Annabelle's. To him, Pauline was the carefree one, full of life and laughter, a young woman who brightened any room she walked into. But one night, the club would lose its spark, and Reilly would lose far more. It started when Pauline entered the office, likely just making her rounds or checking on things before closing. But as she stepped in, she found herself face to face with Shu Ki-lung, a staff member originally from Hong Kong who had been silently looting the club's safe. Caught in the act, he panicked. In a desperate attempt to silence her, he wrapped his hands around her neck, choking the life out of her. In the aftermath, Lung tried to cover his tracks. He carried Pauline's lifeless body to the landing, where he tied a rope around her neck and draped her over the banister, staging it to look like she had taken her own life. Paddy Reilly was the one who discovered her. He found her hanging, the tragic scene suggesting a suicide. But in his heart, he couldn't believe it. Pauline wasn't someone who would end her own life, not his spirited daughter. And when he noticed the safe had been robbed, his grief turned to certainty. This wasn't a tragedy of despair. It was something far more sinister. The police saw through the setup immediately and wasted no time in arresting Lung. Reilly was devastated, and soon rumors spread that he'd put a 30,000-pound hit on Lung, a massive sum at the time and a testament to his heartbreak and anger. During his trial, Leung spun a story, claiming he had been forced into the robbery by two gangsters. He alleged that one was a foreign man named Hassin, and the other was from Liverpool, though he conveniently couldn't remember his name. According to Leung, it was these men who had killed Pauline when she walked in on them. The jury saw through his story immediately. Yet, the tale he wove, a dramatic account of gangsters and guns, was a testament to the gritty reputation of 1980s Edinburgh, a city where even the most outlandish stories of underworld figures and violence felt disturbingly believable. For Reilly, his daughter's tragic death marked a turning point, pushing him further toward going legit. Alongside Williamson and Boswell, he began to see the writing on the wall, sensing that the era of unchecked criminal power was nearing its end. New faces were emerging on the Edinburgh crime scene, men with street reputations who were quick to see the potential in trafficking hard drugs. Among them, Billy Lynch from Tollcross stood out as one of the most successful. With the backing of his brothers, Andrew, Jackie, and Peter, Billy brought a level of business acumen that set him apart from the usual street operators. His connections extended into the boxing world, giving him influence and respect. Andrew, known for his dedication to fitness, was the steady hand of the family, known for keeping a cool head. But the trouble often came from Jackie. Jackie Lynch was a volatile character, short, with a fierce squint and a penchant for violence. He dabbled in heroin, alcohol, and just about any substance he could get his hands on, making him a loose cannon with more enemies than allies. Yet it was Billy Lynch's feud with John Gray from Broughton that nearly led to disaster. For reasons known only to him, Gray took a deep dislike to Billy, and tensions between the two threatened to spill over into something deadly. John Gray wasn't deeply embedded in the criminal underworld, but he was a feared hard man that no one dared to challenge. Despite his reputation as a psychopath, he was despised on the streets for another reason: a history of violent offenses and a reputation as a rapist. In the pubs of Edinburgh, Gray had started making unsettling claims, telling anyone who'd listen that he'd fallen out with Billy Lynch over a drug deal. But it didn't stop there. Gray was openly threatening to kill Lynch and his entire family. People were stunned. Targeting Lynch was one thing, but threatening his wife and young children crossed a line, even in these circles. Gray's violent streak was already well known. Around this time, he had already torched several homes with people inside, including that of Patrick Pal Stephen, a local drug addict and dealer. One night, John Gray decided it was time to turn his threats against Billy Lynch into action. Fueled by drink and a twisted sense of purpose, he convinced a man named John Clive Clavita to drive him out, forcing him to play his reluctant accomplice in what would become a night of terror. They drove through the darkened streets until they reached Brougham Street, where Billy Lynch's house stood quiet under the night sky. Inside, Billy, his wife Joyce, and their 3 young sons were fast asleep, unaware of the danger lurking outside. Gray crept up to the house, lit a petrol bomb, and hurled it through a window, intent on turning his threats into something far more destructive. But fate intervened. The bomb hadn't been filled with enough petrol. The flames sputtered and died out, causing only minimal damage. Miraculously, the family was unharmed, the children safe in their beds. For Billy Lynch, this attack crossed a line. John Gray had tried to bring violence into his home, endangering his family. Enraged, Lynch gathered a group of trusted men, including Grant Turnbull, and set out with one goal in mind: to hunt down John Gray, and make him pay for what he had done. The police soon caught wind of what was happening and decided to make a preemptive move. They raided Billy Lynch's house, hoping to find evidence of the plans brewing against Gray. Inside, they found Billy with his wife, his sister and brother-in-law, Grant Turnbull, and their solicitor, James McIntyre. The officers tore through Billy's home, searching every corner for weapons, but came up empty-handed. Billy was careful. He wouldn't leave something as incriminating as a gun lying around. Ironically, a few years down the line, that same solicitor, James McIntyre, would find himself behind bars for possession of firearms. Meanwhile, John Gray managed to keep out of Billy Lynch's reach, dodging the men determined to settle the score. But he couldn't evade the law. In 1983, Gray appeared in court facing a staggering list of 29 charges, including 5 counts of rape and 12 of assault. Described by prosecutors as a Jekyll and Hyde character, Gray was finally sentenced to 12 years in prison, putting an end to his reign of terror. Gray spent time at Barlinnie Prison alongside Jimmy Boyle, who was considered Scotland's hardest prisoner at the time. Rumor has it that Gray slashed Jimmy with a knife during an altercation when they were both placed in Barlinnie's special unit. In a strange twist of fate, just a few years later, in 1990, Billy Lynch's brother Jackie found himself facing a murder charge. The evidence against him was damning. In broad daylight, outside the Alan Breck pub on Constitution Street in Leith, Jackie was witnessed by dozens of bystanders as he shot Pat "Pal" Stevens 6 times. With a smirk on his face, he walked away from the scene, leaving shock and chaos behind. Jackie claimed he'd acted out of fear and anger. He despised Pal Steven, blaming him not only for threats, but also for selling heroin to Jackie's own nephew and niece, both of whom had died from overdoses. Ultimately, Jackie was sentenced to 15 years in prison, but he would barely serve any of it. Stricken with AIDS, he passed away soon after beginning his sentence. Jackie Lynch may have been justified in his anger over his nephew and niece's heroin overdoses. Such tragedies were all too common in 1980s Edinburgh. Much of the drug flooding the streets was being supplied by a new wave of dealers, including figures like George Dode Buchanan. By the 1990s, Edinburgh's criminal landscape had transformed. The old ways and values had faded, replaced by a new breed of crime where drugs and business strategies took center stage. Many of the old figures had turned legitimate, while some of the current players operated in a gray area between legal and illegal. The housing schemes were now filled with addicts, and ecstasy dominated the club scene. Cocaine, and soon crack cocaine, began overtaking heroin as the drugs of choice in Edinburgh's underworld. The city saw an influx of new faces. Squads from Glasgow, Irish gangs, Yardies, all vying for a share of the expanding drug trade. Even the Chinese crime circles, once left to their own specialities in illegal gambling and prostitution, found themselves drawn into the drug market. Meanwhile, the white slave trade funneled women from former Soviet states into the city's growing underworld. Edinburgh, with its vibrant tourism, festivals, and universities, had become a cosmopolitan city where dozens of languages mingled on the streets alongside English. And crime was no different. A melting pot of opportunity for the most enterprising, where the ruthless thrived in a city now wide open for the taking. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, then please don't forget to hit that like button and kindly leave a comment. Your support and engagement really helps the channel. And to go one better, don't forget to subscribe to Dark Sleuth Secrets for more stories from the hidden side of history. And until next time, stay curious and keep sleuthing.